And now we're going to discuss Hume's moral theory. It is contained in a wonderfully brief little book called An Enquiry Considering the Principles of Morals, of which Hume was particularly proud. He thought it was his greatest work. Elegant, witty, concise, and very brief, and very well polished. It was his considered opinions about the human moral problem in question. Hume's moral theory represents, I would urge, a transitional phase in the history of Anglo-American moral theory between a preceding theory which he drew on, which is known as the Scottish school of moral sense or sentiment, the belief of Francis Hutcheson and Thomas Reid that each and every one of us is filled with a sort of moral sense which ticks us off when we do right and wrong actions or perceive them, and the 19th century view known as utilitarianism or consequentialism. And Hume very much is a transitional figure. He draws on both schools and really is very much one of the seminal creators of the latter school. In many ways, however, I would urge his theory can be seen as a precursor to that of Nietzsche, specifically Nietzsche's genealogical interpretation of morality. And in fact, in many ways, they come up with identical conclusions, the principal difference being their judgment about them. They both describe the same state of moral affairs. Nietzsche looks at it and is filled with disgust and contempt. Whereas very much in keeping with Hume's character, Hume views it far more positively and sees our moral situation as, with Nietzsche in ways, irrational, but as marvelously so, as a rich and rewarding part of life. So, again, we'll find that it is not, Hume's moral theory is not just his particular interpretation, but his evaluation of that interpretation, which is particularly unique and, I would urge, compelling. Now, like Nietzsche, Hume doesn't actually offer a theory of morals. Right? What I mean by a theory of morals are a prescribed set of duties. Right? Such a theory would tell us what we ought to do, what right consists in, what virtue consists in, what morality consists in, and then we would use it as a sort of algorithm for running our lives. Rather, Hume has, instead of a prescriptive moral theory, a descriptive moral theory, which is to say, a scientific question about morality. Hume doesn't try and teach us what we should do, because Hume points out we already know what we should do. We make moral judgments all the time, constantly in all of our lives, and have no qualms or difficulty doing so. The really interesting question is, how did we ever get to do that? I mean, it's quite straightforward how we would learn to call one thing red and another green. It's, however, a rather different question as to how we would learn to call one set of actions or behaviors good and another bad. How did we learn to use those words? How did we learn to apply them in particular contexts? And that is, of course, exactly the same project that Nietzsche takes on. It's an historical and empirical question. That is to say, how in heaven's name, or in nature's name, much closer to Hume, did we ever learn to make such a thing as morality in the first place? How did it ever arise? Thus, he's interested in describing the cause of moral judgment and the cause of moral evaluation among the human species, and showing in what such judgments consist, rather than prescribing a foundational moral theory. And it's, the more one thinks of it, a fair question, right? Animals apparently don't make moral judgments. We have no evidence that lions feel regret about eating gazelles. How is it that we ever learn to feel regrets and call this good and this bad? It's not a foundational moral theory. It doesn't tell us the essence of right action, the essence of wrong action. It rather is a scientific explanation of what in fact we commonly call good and bad and what causes us to do that. Hume argues that our moral judgments find their origin in a sentiment of approbation or approval. It is, as it were, a passion. Unlike our normal passions, however, it's a very calm passion. Anger, anxiety, fear, lust are powerful passions. They overcome the soul, as it were, or the mind, and grip us. The moral passions are much calmer. They are contemplative. And therefore, we can feel the distinction between, say, our anger and our feeling of moral approval or disapproval. And of course, moral approval occurs when we see an action which we consider good, and disapproval, a calm passion, occurs when we see an action that we consider bad. His deep point is that this is not the result, these moral judgments, of some abstract or rational interpretation or deliberation or proof, in fact, that reason doesn't really enter into it. And he has several arguments on behalf of that view. None of them proofs, but again, scientific empirical observations. And the first is that all of our moral judgments are in fact temporally preceded and conjoined by a sentiment of approbation. Right? So when you see someone doing a kind act, you feel a certain amount of approval before you say to yourself, well, that's the right thing to do. He's doing or she's doing the right thing. Prior to that, we feel a sort of warm glow about us. We contemplate it with a calm sort of approval. And as we know from our last lecture, whenever we see such constant conjunctions, that is our sign of a causal relation. In fact, that's all that we have as the markings of causality. And that's his first argument, is that we do always find, in fact, that constant conjunction of a sentiment of approval upon perceiving good action and disapproval upon perceiving bad action. Similarly, he argues, moral judgment can't be based on rational deliberation. And his example, again, are simpletons and children. Right? Children are more than capable of distinguishing right and wrong, of knowing that it's good to share and bad to be selfish. Right? All children over 6 know that. And he says they can't have argued it out rationally because they're not capable of doing logical demonstration at that age. Therefore, you know it's not a rational proof on the part of the child. And similarly with the simpleton. And then, being the partisan of common life and the common man that Hume is, he also points out something which is, of course, quite embarrassing to philosophers. And incidentally, those who are the most rational aren't necessarily the best people. There have been plenty of philosophically acute persons that were absolute swine in their personal lives and that have done heinous acts. And there are plenty of geniuses who have been evil. So we know it's not reason that leads people to virtuous behavior contra Plato, contra Socrates, contra the rationalists, because there have been plenty of perfectly rational people like Machiavelli, like Napoleon, like perhaps Stalin, perhaps Hitler, who have been brilliant people, but evil. So it can't be rationality that leads to moral judgment. Okay. Given that the cause of our moral behavior, then, is probably that sentiment of approval or disapproval, depending on the case, the critical question becomes, what makes us approve of some acts and disapprove of others? Why call kindness good and cruelty bad? And then the question for Hume becomes, why are your sentiments of approval enlivened by some actions and not others? Why is it that you do get a warm feeling when you see kindness, and you don't get a warm feeling when you see a man whipping a horse? It doesn't enliven the same sentiment. How can we explain this? Not on a deductive level, but on a causal level, on an experiential, on a scientific level. And Hume's attempt to answer the question scientifically takes the form of saying, let us look at all of the virtues which we consider to be virtuous, which we consider to be good, which we approve of, and see if they all have at least one property in common, which might be that which instinctually prompts us to feel approval or disapproval. And of course, he does find that element in his view of the virtues. I'm going to give it to you beforehand so we can see how he argues for it, and that is utility or usefulness, that which conduces to the good of the community or the happiness of the largest number of people. Whenever we experience a phenomena which we believe is conducive to public utility, to common human happiness, we get, as Nietzsche would have put it, a warm feeling in our pancreas. Or as Hume would say, we feel a wonderful sentiment of approval. We're enlivened with a sense of almost aesthetic beauty in contemplating this sort of moral behavior. Well, Hume says, all right, let's run through the virtues. The most obvious and universally acclaimed virtue is benevolence, right? Kindness to other people. And it's universally acknowledged to be a virtue. Its most distinctive characteristic is that it tends to promote the public good, right? Acts of charity and kindness clearly result in a further creation of human happiness, not only for the individuals involved, but for the whole society. Its consequences are positive. Thus, what causes us to respond to acts of benevolence with that sentiment of approval is the perception that such acts conduce to, result in, the happiness or utility of the community. All right, so much for benevolence. He then turns to the social virtue of justice and wants to prove not only is utility the most significant feature of justice, it's in fact the only feature. If it was not for utility, no one would consider justice a virtue. That's an extremely strong position. And understand, first of all, what he means by justice. He doesn't mean anything abstract. He means actual legal justice, that which is used for mediating property disputes and maintaining public safety and order. He wants to show that that is entirely based on utility. And by the way, it's worth noting, he's rejecting the entire Hobbesian tradition of making such arguments based on a state of nature. Right? Hume's an empiricist. Show me the state of nature. It's never exist. That's a myth, like the Genesis story. That's not a scientific explanation. He says, let us look at actual states of justice, and the way we will show that justice is based on utility is by throwing at us counterexamples. Places where justice would not have utility, and see if we would think it would obtain. So he says, let us suppose we lived in a society of superabundance, much like Eden, where there's more than enough of all of the goods and luxuries of life for everyone in society. There's in fact a superfluity. And he points out, if that was the case, there'd be no need for justice. Why call this watch mine and that watch yours if there's more than enough watches to go around and they're all wonderfully beautiful? You want this one? Take it. I'll get another. There would be no use or function for justice in such a society, and therefore it wouldn't exist. And that is a good point if we think about the Genesis myth again of Eden. There are no laws in Eden, are there? Right? There's no courts. You don't need them. There's more than enough for everyone. Similarly, we saw in Moore's society, a society of utopia where there's superabundance. They have no laws. Right? They need no laws, precisely because justice only exists where you don't have superabundance. So that's one case. Take another case, a society not of superabundance, but where everyone was selfless. We were all perfectly, in more sense, Christian, and loved each other just as much, if not more, than ourselves. Again, there would be no need for justice. Why? Because we would each take care of one another. If you wanted to steal my watch, I wouldn't even let you. I'd give it to you. I'd say, I'm more concerned about your happiness than mine. Please take it. You want to take my house? If it'll make you happy, please. I'm more than happy to take something else or sleep in the street. So if we were truly selfless, all saints, as it were, in a society of saints, you would not have courts. You wouldn't have justice. Why? It has no utility. It has no function. It doesn't conduce to public happiness. It's unnecessary. And therefore, it would cease to exist. And Hume is pointing out something interesting to us. He's not saying, look, this is some abstract rational reconstruction in the sky. There are, in fact, actual cases of this. Think about the normal human family. Do you have a system of courts in the human family where, the child sues to the parents and says, well, I think you've violated my rights, and I have a right to watch, Laverne and Shirley whenever it's on or whatever? Not at all, because the human family is just such a selfless environment. The society is based, or that institution or organization is based on mutual affection, right? It is relatively selfless. In fact, the only points at which we do bring in things like family law at the moments where that mutual affection breaks down and where there seems to be a lack of such intimate regard and selflessness. But normally when that doesn't exist, there's no rules of justice for the family. Mutual regard, more than sufficient. Therefore, because it's not useful in the family, we don't have it in the family. And again, think of friendships. Do you have abstract laws of justice in dealing with friends? Not at all. Because, again, those relationships are based on a selfless affection for one another. And justice is not useful, and therefore it doesn't exist. Now, let's take another opposite case. Instead of superabundance, how about a case of super scarcity? There's not enough for anyone to get along, even with the utmost frugality and hard work. If I work an 18-hour day and save every penny I have, I still don't have enough to feed myself, wife, and children. In such a society, can we expect to find the existence of justice? And he says no. If it was such that all of your labor, industry, and frugality were insufficient to supply anyone the means of livelihood, justice would be absolutely useless, completely useless, and we would find literally what Hobbes talks about, a war of all against all. Right? So where it is not useful, in the case of super scarcity, again, the operation of justice would certainly be suspended. Take another example. Suppose you were to find yourself in the company of thieves and rogues, right? People who felt no qualms about stealing, murdering, or doing any insidious act. Would justice have any utility in such a situation? No. It would simply be an act of stupidity to act justly in such a context. And he says in such societies there is no justice. Right? Similarly, I guess you would suppose if you took a pirate ship, there is no law of justice there. There's the rule of the jungle. Whoever is the strongest is the head. And he stays on top by noticing who his first mate is. As soon as his first mate seems to get a little bit antsy, you simply throw him overboard. Right? Justice has no place there. It has no function, no utility, does not produce the common good, therefore its operation is suspended. Now, why do we have justice? Because our case is a sort of moderate middle ground between all of these. We don't have super scarcity, and we don't have super abundance. We can, in fact, get by through industry and frugality. And therefore, justice is useful for the well-being of our society. And we react to displays of justice with a sentiment of approval. Right? We feel good when we see justice. And when we see an act of injustice, we respond with that sentiment of disapproval. We feel disappointed, perhaps a bit depressed. And then he offers one more example, which is extremely important because it's an example that Kant takes up and answers in an extremely different way. Hume says, imagine that we discover there really is life on Mars. And it's completely rational, they have the same intellectual faculties that we have, but there's one difference. They have no advanced military technology, and they're exactly 1 inch tall. The Martians then come down and land on our planet. They have a lot of wealth. Do we treat them justly? And Hume's argument is, no. And you know why? Because we don't have to. Because they're completely powerless, and then therefore justice is no longer in our interest. It's not useful for us in our community, and therefore we would push such people around. And if we did treat them kindly, it would be because we're remarkably morally progressive. More likely than not, we would simply exploit them and use them however we wish. That's an extremely dark view at first. We look at that and we say, my God, Hume, that's a very negative view of human nature. But Hume doesn't think that at all. Hume thinks that's naturalistic and empirical, and he has good evidence for that. Not that he approves of it. In fact, just the opposite. But rather, Hume is pointing something out in the late 18th century. He says in his work, if you doubt that doctrine, well, then think about the way we treat women in our society. Right? Women are just like those Martians. They're just as rational as we are. The same intellectual faculties and abilities. The only thing they lack is power and the ability to inflict their will on us. And how do we treat them? Well, in the 18th century, women have exactly this many rights. Right? Can't vote, can't sue, have no legal personality once they're married. The law of coverture means that they will be subsumed under the identity of their husbands. Domestic peace is enforced by the rule of thumb, which is that you can't beat your wife with any stick thicker than your thumb. And Hume says, so look at how we treat women, if you're so sure we'd be kind to these aliens. And for that matter, and here he gets quite critical of us Americans, he says, and look how people in North America treat Indians. Certainly they're humans too. Certainly they have all the rational faculties we do. And yet, because they can't enforce their will on us, because they only have flint-head arrows, where we have, muzzle-loading rifles, we don't respect any of their rights. We don't give them any rights. We don't treat them with any justice at all. So, Hume is pointing out that it's not just a dour view of human nature that he's arguing, but in fact an empirical fact. Right? We only treat people with justice when it conduces to utility, to the public good of our community. Hume is not, however, I must point out, satisfied with that state of affairs. And he includes the possibility of moral progress. Moral progress comes when we learn to think of those women, or those Indians, as ourselves. We begin somehow to include them within our sentimental universe. And here's where Hume is remarkably prescient. He says, how do we learn to do that? Do we do that from reading Plato? Do we do that from reading Descartes? No. You learn to do that, to enlarge your sentiments, from reading poetry, from reading literature. If you want to learn how to enlarge your sentiments towards Native Americans, read Black Elk Speaks, right? Or or go see Dances with Wolves. That's where we get moral education, not from philosophy books, from literature. How do we learn to treat women like people? Pick up Jane Austen. Pick up Toni Morrison. Pick up Alice Walker. That's where you'll learn your moral instruction. Because what does literature do? It flexes our moral muscles. It flexes our sensibilities, our sentiments. It teaches us to feel towards people that we previously hadn't thought of just like us as being just like us. We learn to stick ourselves in that situation. And oddly enough, what you have with Hume is, if you remember, in a way, philosophy began, at least with Plato, in the fight against poetry. Right? It was philosophy against poetry. The poets teach you bad morals. The philosophers teach you good morals. Hume has come up with the wonderful idea that the best thing we can do is surrender to the poets. They were right all along. The poets do teach us morality, far more so than the philosophers. And since our moral action is based on our sentiments, on our, to speak romantically, on our heart rather than our head, then dry, abstruse metaphysics of the sort that Hume writes is certainly not the place where we should look for moral edification. We should instead look to fiction and literature, to the recreation of a fanciful, poetic, moral universe. And in fact, I would argue that many subsequent philosophers in the 20th century have argued just such a point, that really moral progress really does consist in describing others as part of us and ceasing to see the other as the other. When men begin to see, women aren't really that different from us. In fact, they're part of us. And women towards men, etc. Okay, now, so much for justice and benevolence. How about government and political society? Again, Hume says the sole basis of those institutions, and the reason we think they are virtuous and good, is because they're useful. Right? If all people were naturally just, if we had a society of saints, there'd be no government. There'd be no need for it. We could have perfect anarchy. And again, we'd have no government because it has no use, no utility. Take another example, the laws of nations. Right? When do we begin to get the formation of international law? Hume says you only get it when you begin to get international commerce and international trade. Because until you're actually exchanging commodities on a regular basis, there's no usefulness to having international laws. What's the purpose? There's nothing to mediate. It's only when you have those interests tied up with property that there is some sense to having international law, and hence that's the moment at which it arises. Similarly, the moment you declare war against another country is the moment when all intercourse ceases. And he says, and that's the moment that laws of nations become suspended. No one believes in the laws of nations when they're at war. Right? Everyone believes in freedom of the seas until the First World War. Right? Until the moment it starts, at which point the British say we will sink all German shipping, the Germans say we will sink all American shipping, all enemy shipping, and of course the Americans who are non-combatants say whatever happened to the laws of nations. And Hume laughs. It's no longer in the interests of Germany, England, and France to have such laws of nations because they're at war, they're no longer useful, and hence they're suspended. Now, the question becomes, why is it that utility excites our sentiments of approval? Granted that it is utility, that we found that constant conjunction, that we've got that causal network, right? We've got it worked out. Why? Why is it that it should provoke in us this sentiment of approval? And here Hume turns aesthetic. He says there must be an inherent psychological or instinctual disposition put in us to approve of whatever is useful. And again, here's where he's being extremely naturalistic. If we had depended on our reason to recognize utility, we would have all died long ago by murdering one another. We're not that smart a species. Don't flatter yourself. Obviously, somehow in our evolution, as he puts it, nature gave us a capacity to instinctually respond to perceived utility without reflecting on it with the sentiment of approval. And in fact, that turns out to be a sort of natural beauty. Right? In other words, when you see a good act, it is almost like looking at a beautiful painting. You are wrapped in a sort of a calm passion of beauty, of rapture, of sublimity. And that's his point. That's what moral judgment is too. It's essentially of a piece with aesthetic judgment. It is, as it were, to put it in a negative way, taste. Though Hume doesn't put it in a negative way. Hume thinks that taste, of course, is something that is cultivated. So reading fine fiction, seeing good movies, learning of other cultures is part of the cultivation of our moral tastes. Right? Learning to see the world through other lenses. I can't stress how important that aestheticization is. One, because it sparks a violent reaction from Kant, who finds it absolutely despicable. But secondly, because it is a sharp rejoinder to Hume's Calvinist background, which teaches us that good behavior is a duty, a painful duty we all really will towards privately, lust and avarice and the will to power and violence. And it is only because we conquer our base instincts that we are able, through the help of God, to live just and moral lives. And Hume is, if anything, revolted by that perspective. Hume's viewpoint is that virtuous behavior is not some onerous duty. It's the best part of life. It's like going to a museum and seeing beautiful works of art. It's part of a cultivated, well-lived life. Right? Virtue is its own reward. It is naturally pleasant to be virtuous. And anyone who doesn't think it is a nabob, is an uncultivated boor. If you think it's better, as it were, to, as his example, step on someone's gouty toes just for the giggles of it, Hume says what we have here is an uncultivated swine. We have a person who thinks soda pop tastes better than scotch. Well, it may taste better at first, but if you can ever cultivate your taste, you'll realize soda pop is for children. Adults like scotch or ale or whatever our preferred cultivated taste is. It's not a natural thing per se. It has to be developed through cultivation. So with moral behavior. We learn after a while to feel a remarkable amount of self-satisfaction and joy at seeing good acts and at doing good acts. And he has a very good point here. When you read of the heroic acts of, say, George Washington or Frederick Douglass or Abraham Lincoln, I mean, are you like a computer? You assimilate the information. Yes, they did a good act. You know, like the Terminator or something like that. Not at all. It gives you a very warm and proud feeling. You look at that and you approve and you feel good about it. And that's Hume's point, that it is pleasant to observe right action, and it is even more pleasant to do it. It is part of a cultivated, well-lived, well-rounded life. Now, as I've mentioned, Hume stands at a juncture between the common sense school and utilitarianism. In a way, he is, I would urge, leaning stronger towards the utilitarian perspective, the notion of a common good. A question arises in subsequent thinkers and to Hume, how much moral progress is possible? Is it possible for us to infinitely expand our sentiments to cover the entire world? Or will there always be and us and an other. Even aside from that question, I think there's a more problematic issue with such utilitarianism and consequentialism. And that is the problem of ultimate consequences. I want to argue as follows. The two major schools of ethical judgment, one of which is the duty-based ethic, where we judge actions on the basis of intention, and the other is the consequentialist view of Hume, really come out not so much to be based on distinct ontologies, though they are at that, but more profoundly, such ontologies really hang on a distinct view of the causal nexus. So, what Professor Segru has so aptly called the two-world people, the nature plus people, when they, for the most part, judge moral behavior, we all see the same thing. We see an agent do an act, either good or bad. Now, the way you judge that act will be a function of the way you interpret the causal nexus. If you believe in final causality, which is the doctrine that that act is the result of someone's purpose or intention, and that intention and purpose is the final cause in the sense that after you've got that purpose and intention, there's nothing else to be asked about that act. You will judge that act on the basis of that intention, right? So if someone tries to help you but doesn't do a very good job, you say, well, you meant well, and I appreciate the act anyways. The notion that intentions count. And of course, that's an important principle in our own law. It's how we distinguish between, accidents. Intention has an important function in murder proceedings and assignation of criminal responsibility. And that's one view. That's the final causal view. And you can really only have final causality if you believe in things like intentionality, which in turn sort of hinges on that two-world viewpoint. Let's take the Humean view for a minute. Take the exact same phenomena in action with an agent and says, I don't want to know the final cause because I don't believe in final causes, because that's spooky stuff that goes bump in the dark. Rather, we judge that action in an agent by looking at its place as an efficient cause rather than a final result. So it's a cause of consequences. What happened? And this is, in our common sense belief, takes the form of the old saw, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So meaning well doesn't cut the mustard. The real question is, how does it work out? And this will become extremely important principally for David Hume's best friend, Adam Smith, who reads Hume profoundly and realizes, you know something, if Hume's right with his consequentialism, then a la Gordon Gekko, greed works. Right? I mean, what is capitalism about? It's about people trying to exploit other people. And from a duty-oriented, final causal analysis, that's bad. But what are the results? Everyone gets rich, right? We've got technical progress in material possessions. Then the significance comes in judging consequences. I would urge the problem, though I am attracted to the consequentialist view, the problem with consequentialism is, when do you stop calculating the consequences? When does that chain end? And moreover, how careful can you be in judging consequences? So I want to suggest, in line with a professor I once heard at Columbia by the name of Charles Lorimer, that there is in fact a practical heterogeneity to common sense morality. There are times when someone steps on my foot trying, in fact, to help me carry something, that I want to use final causality and say, that's okay, you were trying to help me out and I appreciate it anyways. There are other points, however, in my life, at which I will want to judge something on the basis of its consequences. Some politician says, let us do X for, the American farmer, and he means well as can be, and the result is going to be massive impoverishment of the nation. I'm not going to give him moral credit. I'm going to say, look, you are responsible for at least trying to calculate the consequences of such a reckless course of action. And then, of course, there is a third sort of category of moral judgment when we come across phenomena that we just think are inherently good in and of itself. Right? And that's, in British philosophy, I think perhaps the best expression of that was from a fellow by the name of Bishop Butler, Joseph Butler, who argued that there are some things like telling the truth, which you don't do on the basis of the consequences, because sometimes the consequences are bad. You don't do it on the basis of intentions, because sometimes the intentions are bad. You do it because it's just the right thing to do, and there's nothing more to it. And that's, as it were, the bottom line of such moral judgment. So I would urge that there is, in fact, I think, at least a practical heterogeneity, or better yet, a heterogeneity to practical reason or to moral deliberation. Nonetheless, I think consequentialism does have a certain power to it, precisely when we turn to social judgment. And that's why it always takes that utilitarian form. Once we get beyond the individual, as we could put it, microcosmic level, and get to the mesocosm, right, the society as a whole, intentions become far less significant. We don't care that Herbert Hoover really did mean well during the Great Depression, and I'm sure he did. He was a pietist Quaker of extremely beautiful sentiments. 33% of the people are unemployed and hungry. Your intentions don't count at that level. What counts is the consequences. Do your programs work? And we might well turn to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and say, you know, he was a very callous politician. Everything he did was on the basis of polls, and I think that's actually quite accurate. He was an extremely slick character. But that should not be the basis of judgment, as I see it. The basis of judgment should be, what happened? Did it work? Were people's lives better off? And I can't help thinking that, in fact, they were. And that's the basis on which we judge it. And I think this is important in political and social judgment precisely because we have a veil of in which we cannot actually ascertain people's intentions. The only intentions I can be certain of are my own. I can be charitable in my construction of yours, but I can't really know. So on such issues, I think that's precisely where intentional judgment gets in the way of good policy. All we have that's objective, that we can all see, are likely consequences, likely results. And while I have in many ways, I think, tried to suggest the pitfalls of consequentialism, and I think they're serious, in many ways severe, I cannot stress how important an innovation it was in the case of Hume. No one had ever thought to judge action on the basis of consequences. I mean, they made it at a common sense level, but you'll never find it in any philosopher. Every philosopher up to this point assumes that the intentions you have is the basis of your moral evaluation. Hume is the first to go beyond that. Now, I want, finally, summation, to return to the problem of Hume's genealogy of morals and Nietzsche's. Because in a certain sense, Hume is almost identical to Nietzsche. What Hume calls an instinctual aesthetic beauty to our moral judgment, Nietzsche calls herd instinct. Right? He says, yeah, it's the same thing you find in cattle. Cattle want to make as much cattle as possible. And that's all that morality is. You want as many smelly mutations that look just like you as you can find. And it's just a genetic programming. It's dumb. There's nothing right about it. There's nothing virtuous about it. There's nothing just about it. It's completely stupid herd instinct. And in many ways, Hume agrees. He says, well, yeah, it is. It's an instinctual response, and it's obviously done to promote the good of the many, which is exactly what Nietzsche is saying. And Nietzsche, however, suggests, why should we help the many? I mean, they're all smelly and stupid to begin with. Just help people like me. I'm wise. In a way, what we have is the classic example of the glass being half full or half empty. Another way of looking at that, though, might be a question of expectations. That's Humean, as I've suggested from Professor Sugrew's introduction. Jobian, stance towards being, fills us with low expectations. We don't expect to unravel the mysteries of the universe. And therefore, when we find out that morality is really just a sort of instinctual response for the well-being of all of our fellow people, we're not shocked and scandalized by it. That's just about all we ever expected to find in the first place. And we can be more than satisfied with it. We can say, that glass is half full. Yeah, it's a pleasant thing to get that warm feeling in my pancreas when I see someone doing well. It's just, I feel great. You know, it's not a question of stupidity. But if you come in with those Promethean instincts, as Professor Segru suggested, where you expect much more, where you expect to get morality justified, logically, and provable, and you don't find it, well, then you have the strong disposition to say, well, the party's over, right? I mean, if there's no such thing as moral proof, then forget morality. Let's all get a sword and go in for the battle of all against all. Or let's just celebrate the Ubermensch, the Superman, the Overman, that person who can transcend his moral prejudices, who can transcend his ability to feel kind things. And I think that distinction of dispositions, that choosing on the one hand the disposition towards being satisfied with something we might call semi-success, or the view that either I have it all the way down, either I can prove my morality, or I'm going to take my dolly dishes and go home. Right? It's like playing marbles. Either I can win every time, or if not, I'm taking them and going home. That, in a way, is the great disjuncture in modern moral thought that I think has really occurred since Hume's time. I don't think in many ways that many philosophers have gone beyond Hume. What has been the difference is the way they judge the Humean paradigm. Do they see it in any chain way? Well, then morality is just an unthinking, stupid reflex. And it has no basis in anything. Or if there is, it would be something which wasn't the herd morality. Or do we adopt the Humean stance? That, sure, it's an instinct to make, for us to help our fellow creatures, but we're animals. What else would we suggest? Well, what would be more sensible for animals to do than to help their fellow beings? And the fact that we can find that pleasant, what a joy. We can be more than satisfied with that state of affairs. And it's with that dilemma, or that choice, as I think, which is still a vital choice for us all, that I'd like to leave you.